The Carte Noire Readers, your moment of indulgence. Laurence Fox reads Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens tells the story of Pip, a poor orphan who comes into money, then becomes humbled by his own arrogance, an arrogance matched only by that of Estella, a young girl raised by the scornful dowager, Mrs. Havisham. In this chapter, we find the two children meeting for the first time. Laurence Fox reads Great Expectations by Charles Dickens.
So, are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. We went into the house by a side door. The great front entrance had two chains across it outside, and the first thing I noticed was that the passages were all dark, and that she had left a candle burning there. She took it up, and we went through more passages and up a staircase, and still it was all dark, and only the candle lighted us. At last we came to the door of a room, and she said, "Go in." I answered more in shyness than politeness. "After you, miss." To this she returned, "Don't be ridiculous, boy, I'm not going in," scornfully walked away, and, what was worse, took the candle with her. This was very uncomfortable, and I was half afraid. However, the only thing to be done being to knock at the door, I knocked, and was told from within to enter. I entered, therefore, and found myself in a pretty large room, well lighted with wax candles. No glimpse of daylight was to be seen in it. It was a dressing room, as I supposed from the furniture, though much of it was of forms and uses then quite unknown to me. But prominent in it was a draped table with gilded-looking glass, and that I made out at first sight to be a fine lady's dressing-table. Whether I should have made out this object so soon if there had been no fine lady sitting at it, I cannot say. In an armchair, with an elbow resting on the table and her head leaning on that hand, sat the strangest lady I have ever seen, or ever shall see. She was dressed in rich materials, satins and lace and silks, all white. Her shoes were white. She had a long white veil dependent from her hair, and she had bridal flowers in her hair, but her hair was white. Some bright jewels sparkled on her neck and on her hands, and some other jewels lay sparkling on the table. Dresses, less splendid than the dress she wore, in half-packed trunks, were scattered about. She had not quite finished dressing, for she had but one shoe on, the other was on the table near her hand. Her veil was but half arranged, her watch and chain were not put on, and some lace from her bosom lay with those trinkets, and with her handkerchief and gloves and some flowers and a prayer-book, all confusedly heaped about the looking-glass. It was not the first moments that I saw all these things, though I saw more of them in the first moments than might be supposed, but I saw that everything within my view which ought to be white had been white long ago, and had lost its lustre, and was faded and yellow. I saw that the dress had been put upon a rounded figure of a young woman, and that the figure upon which it now hung loose had shrunk to skin and bone. Once I had been taken to see some ghastly waxwork at a fair, representing I know not what impossible personage lying in a state. Once I had been taken to one of our old marsh churches to see a skeleton in the ashes of a rich dress that had been dug out of a vault under the church pavement. Now, waxwork and skeleton seemed to have dark eyes that moved and looked at me. I should have cried out, if I could. "Who is it?" said the lady at the table. "Pip, ma'am." "Pip?" "Mr. Pumblechook's boy, ma'am. Come to play." "Come nearer." "Let me look at you." "Come close." It was when I stood before her, avoiding her eyes, that I took note of her surrounding objects in detail, and saw that her watch had stopped at 20 minutes to 9, and that a clock in the room had stopped at 20 minutes to 9. "Look at me," said Miss Havisham. "You're not afraid of a woman who has never seen the sun since you were born?" I regret to state that I was not afraid of telling the enormous lie comprehended in the answer. "No." "Do you know what I touch here?" she said, laying her hands one upon the other on her left side. "Yes, ma'am." It made me think of the young man. "What do I touch?" "Your heart." "Broken." She uttered the word with an eager look and a strong emphasis and a weird smile that had a kind of boast in it. Afterwards she kept her hands there for a little while, and slowly took them away as if they were heavy. I'm tired, said Miss Havisham. I want diversion. And I have done with men and women. Play. I think it will be conceded by the most disputatious reader that she could hardly have directed an unfortunate boy to do anything in the wide world more difficult to be done under the circumstances. I sometimes have sick fancies. And she went on, and I have a sick fancy that I want to see some play. There, with an impatient movement of the fingers of her right hand. Play. For a moment, with the fear of my sisters working me before my eyes, I had a desperate idea of starting round the room in the assumed character of Mr. Pumblechook's chaise cart, but I felt myself so unequal to the performance that I gave up, and stood looking at Miss Havisham in what I suppose she took for a dogged manner, inasmuch as she said when she had taken a good look at each other, "Are you sullen and obstinate?" "No, ma'am. I'm very sorry for you, and very sorry that I can't play just now. If you complain of me, I shall get into trouble with my sister, so I would do it if I could, but it's so new here, so strange, so fine, and melancholy." I stopped, fearing I might say too much, or had already said it. And we took another long look at each other. Before she spoke again, she turned her eyes from me and looked at the dress she wore, and the dressing table, and finally at herself in the looking-glass. "So new to him," she muttered. "So old to me. So strange to him. So familiar to me. So melancholy to both of us. Call her Stella." She was still looking at the reflection of herself. I thought she was still talking to herself, and kept quiet. "Call her Stella," she repeated, flashing a look at me. "You can do that. Call her Stella at the door." To stand in the dark, in a mysterious passage of an unknown house, bawling a Stella to a scornful young lady, neither visible nor responsive, and feeling it a dreadful liberty so to roar out her name, was almost as bad as playing to order. But she answered at last, and her light came along the long dark passage, like a star. Miss Havisham beckoned her to come close, took a jewel from the table, and tried its effect upon her young fair bosom and against her pretty brown hair. "Your own, one day, my dear, and you will use it well. Let me see you play cards with this boy." "With this boy? Why, he's a common labouring boy." I thought I overheard Miss Havisham answer, only it seemed so unlikely. "Well, you can break his heart." "What do you play, boy?" asked Estella to myself with the greatest disdain. "Nothing but beggar my neighbour, miss." "Beggar him," said Miss Havisham to Estella. So we sat down to cards. It was then that I began to understand that everything in the room had stopped, like a watch and the clock, a long time ago. I noticed that Miss Havisham put down the jewel exactly on the spot from which she had taken it up. As Estella dealt the cards, I glanced at the dressing-room table again and saw that the show upon it, once white, now yellow, had never been worn. I glanced down at the foot from which the shoe was absent, and saw the silk stocking on it, once white, now yellow, had been trodden ragged. Without this arrest of everything, this standing still of all the pale, decayed objects, not even the withered bridal dress on the collapsed form could have looked so like grave's clothes, or the long veil so like a shroud. So she sat, corpse-like, as we played at cards, the frillings and trimmings of her bridal dress looking like earthy paper. I knew nothing, then, of the discoveries that are occasionally made of bodies buried in ancient times, which fall to powder in the moment of being distinctly seen, but I have often thought since that she must have looked as if the admission of the natural light of day would have struck her to dust. "He calls the knaves jacks, this boy," said Estella with disdain before our first game was out. "What coarse hands he has! What thick boots! I'd never, though, been ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair. Her contempt was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. She won the game, and I dealt it. I misdealt, as was only natural when I knew she was lying in wait for me to do wrong, and she denounced me for a stupid, clumsy, labouring boy. "You say nothing of her," remarked Miss Havisham to me as she looked on. "She says many hard things of you, but you say nothing of her. What do you think of her?" "I don't like to say," I stammered. "Tell me in my ear," said Miss Havisham, bending down. "I think she's very proud," I replied in a whisper. "Anything else?" "I think she's very pretty." "Anything else?" "I think she's very insulting." She was looking at me then with a look of supreme aversion. "Anything else?" "I think I should like to go home and never see her again, though she is so pretty." "I'm not sure that I shouldn't like to see her again, but I should like to go home now." "You shall go soon," said Miss Havisham aloud. "Play the game out." Saving for the one weird smile at first, I should have felt almost sure that Miss Havisham's face could not smile. It had dropped into a watchful and brooding expression, most likely when all things about her had become transfixed, and it looked as if nothing could ever lift up again. Her chest had dropped, so that she spoke low and with a dead lull upon her. Altogether she had the appearance of having dropped, body and soul, within and without, under the weight of a crushing blow. I played the game to an end with Estella, and she beggared me. She threw the cards down on the table when she had won them all, as if she despised them for having been one of me. "When shall I have you here again?" said Miss Havisham. "Let me think." I was beginning to remind her that today was Wednesday when she checked me with her former impatient movement of her fingers of her right hand. There. I know nothing of the days of the week. I know nothing of the weeks of the year. Come again after 6 days, you hear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Estella, take him down. Let him have something to eat. Let him roam. Look about while he eats. Go, Pip." I followed the candle down, as I had followed the candle up, and she stood it in the place where we had found it. Until she opened the side entrance, I had fancied, without thinking about it, that it must necessarily be night time. The rush of daylight quite confounded me, and made me feel as if I had been in the candlelight of a strange room many hours. "You're to wait here, you boy," said Estella, and disappeared and closed the door. I took the opportunity of being alone in the courtyard to look at my coarse hands and common boots. My opinion of those accessories was not favourable. They had never troubled me before, but they troubled me now as vulgar appendages. I determined to ask Joe why he had never taught me to call those picture cards jacks, which ought to be called knaves. I wish Joe had been more genteelly brought up, and then I should have been so too. She came back with some bread and some meat and a little mug of beer. She put the mug down on the stones of the yard and gave me the bread and meat without looking at me, as insolently as if I were a dog in disgrace. I was so humiliated, hurt, spurned, offended, angry, sorry. I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart, God knows what its name was, that tears started to my eyes. The moment they sprang there, the girl looked at me with a quick delight in having been the cause of them. This gave me a power to keep them back, and I had to look at her. So she gave me a contemptuous toss, but with a sense, I thought, of having made too sure that I was so wounded, and left me. When she was gone, I looked about me for a place to hide my face in, and got behind one of the gates in the brewery lane and leaned my sleeve against the wall there and leaned my forehead on it and cried, and as I cried I kicked the wall and took a hard twist in my hair, so bitter were my feelings and so sharp was the smart without name that needed counteraction. My sister's bringing up had made me sensitive. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. It may be only small injustice that the child can be exposed to, but the child is small, and its world is small, and its rocking horse stands as many hands high, according to scale, as a big-boned Irish hunter. Within myself, I sustained, from my babyhood, a perpetual conflict with injustice. I had known, from the time when I could speak, that my sister, in her capricious and violent coercion, was unjust to me. I had cherished a profound conviction that her bringing me up by hand gave her no right to bring me up by jerks. Through all my punishments, disgraces, fasts and vigils, and other penitential performances, I had nursed this assurance, and to my communing so much with it in a solitary and unprotected way, I in great part refer to the fact that I was morally timid and very sensitive. I got rid of my injured feelings for the time by kicking them into the brewery wall and twisting them out of my hair, and then I smoothed my face with my sleeve and came from behind the gate. The bread and meat were acceptable, the beer was warming and tingling, and I was soon in spirits to look about me. To be sure, it was a deserted place, down to the pigeon house in the brewery yard, which had been blown crooked on its pole by some high wind, and would have made the pigeons think themselves at sea if there had been any pigeons in the dovecote. No horses in the stable, no pigs in the sty, no malt in the storehouse, no smell of grains and beer in the copper or the vat. All the uses and scents of the brewery might have evaporated with its last reek of sun. In a by-yard there was a wilderness of empty casks, which had a certain sour remembrance of better days lingering about them, but it was too sour to be accepted as a sample of the beer that was gone, and in this respect I remember those recluses as being like most others. Behind the furthest end of the brewery there was a rank garden with an old wall, not so high that I could struggle up and hold on for long enough to look over it and see that the rank garden was a garden of the house, and that it was overgrown with tangled weeds. But there was this track upon the green and yellow paths, as if someone sometimes walked there, and that Estella was walking away from me even then. But she seemed to be everywhere. For when I yielded to the temptation presented by the casks and began to walk on them, I saw her walking on them at the end of the yard of casks. She had her back towards me and held her pretty brown hair spread about her two hands, and never looked around, and passed out of my view directly. So, in the brewery itself, by which I mean the large paved lofty place in which they used to make the beer, and where the brewing utensils still were, when I first went into it, rather oppressed by its gloom, stood near the door looking about me, I saw her pass among the extinguished fires and ascend some light iron stairs, and go out by a gallery high overhead as if she were going out into the sky. It was in this place, and at this moment, that a strange thing happened to my fancy. I thought it a strange thing then, and I thought it a stranger thing long afterwards. I turned my eyes, a little dimmed by looking up to the frosty light, towards the great wooden beam in a low nook of the building near me on my right hand, and I saw the figure hanging there by neck. A figure all in yellow-white, but with one shoe on her foot, and it hung so that I could see that the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper, and the face was Miss Havisham's. A figure all in yellow-white, but with one shoe on the foot, and it hung so that I could see that the faded trimmings of the dress were like earthy paper, and that the face was Miss Havisham's, with a movement going over the whole countenance as if she were trying to call me. In the terror of seeing the figure, and in the terror of being certain that it had not been there a moment before, I at first ran from it, and then ran towards it, and my terror was greatest of all when I found no figure there. Nothing less than the frosty light of the cheerful sky, the sight of the people passing beyond the bars of the courtyard gate, and the reviving influence of the rest of the bread and the meat and the beer would have brought me round. Even with these aids I might not have come to myself as soon as I did, but that I saw Estella approaching with the keys to let me out. She would have some fair reason for looking down upon me, I thought, if she saw me frightened, and she should have no fair reason. She gave me a triumphant glance in passing me, as if she rejoiced that my hands were so coarse and my boots were so thick, and she opened the gate and stood holding it. I was passing out without looking at her, when she touched me with a taunting hand. "Why don't you cry?" "Because I don't want to." "You do?" Been crying till you're half blind, and you're near crying again now." She laughed contemptuously, pushed me out and locked the gate upon me. I went straight to Mr. Pumblechook's and was immensely relieved to find him not at home. So leaving word with the shopman on what day I was wanted at Miss Havisham's again, I set off on the 4-mile walk to our forge, pondering, as I was a common labouring boy, that my hands were coarse, that my boots were thick, that I had fallen into a despicable habit of calling knaves jacks, that I was much more ignorant than I considered myself last night, and generally that I was in a low-lived, bad way.
Rich and velvety carte noire for a more seductive coffee break.